Greiner Talks, about sustainability and transformation. A Greiner podcast episode.
What does it take to change, and how to become a truly sustainable business? That's what we are discussing here. And I'm quite excited because for the first time in this podcast series, I am connected to a guest in the United States. He's a professor of behavioral science at the University of Chicago. He's a teacher at Harvard Extension School, and he's creating amazing content around business ethics and leadership on YouTube. A very warm welcome to you, John Paul Rollert.
I'm so delighted to be here with you, Alexander. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for taking your time. And how are you doing, John? Have you had a chance to have a morning coffee yet?
Well, it's certainly not too early here, but we're a little bit behind you there over in Europe. So I've had 2 cups of coffee. So I'm very excited for this conversation.
John, I have mentioned that you are teaching at some of the world's top universities. But of course, that doesn't say much about you as a person. To get to know you a little bit better, would you like to tell me something personal about you? For example, where did you grow up? Where did your interest for business ethics come from, actually?
Well, that's a great question. Here in the United States, I grew up in 2 very different places when I was a child. I spent my earliest years in Chicago, which is the 3rd largest city in the United States, perhaps familiar to some of you who are listening to this podcast. And so I spent those early years in a very urban metropolitan setting until I was about 12 and a half. And then I moved with my family to our historic family farm, where I believe the 6th generation on the farm in rural western Michigan. And so I went from living in a condominium when I was a child to living with a farmhouse just outside my front porch. So these different perspectives, both kind of an urban and rural perspective, informed me in many different ways and gave me an especial interest in what became the focus of my doctoral study and a lot of my teaching, which is empathy, and trying to understand how we can connect with people whose backgrounds are very different from our own. I had that challenge when I moved from the city to the countryside, and it's been a challenge that has fascinated me ever since.
So, John, your research and your teaching focuses a lot on empathy. It focuses on empathy's application to business ethics, and to leadership. Now, empathy and business, that seems like quite an odd pair to me. How does that go together?
Well, I think there are 2 ways in which it goes together. One, arguably a little bit more naturally, but a little, I'd say, less likely in the minds of many people. And another way, which is, I think, more aspirational. So the way in which I would say it goes together that's a little bit more unlikely is that if any of you have ever been in a position of, say, salesmanship, when you're trying to connect with a counterparty, you spend a lot of time thinking about what that other person wants, what that other person's needs and desires are, and how you can connect with that person in a sales situation. Well, you're putting empathy to work. You're putting yourselves into the shoes of another person, and you're trying to figure out what they need as opposed to what you need. Now, that's a kind of commercial application of empathy, and it's one that Adam Smith in his own way talks about in The Wealth of Nations. It isn't what we normally think of when we think of empathy. We tend to mix a concern for empathy, understanding what the needs of others are and putting ourselves in their shoes, with a desire for sympathy, which is understood as kind of pity, kindness, care. Now, certainly, insofar as we mix empathy and sympathy, we come up with a different kind of vision of empathy. And that is, how do I make sure that my pursuits of my own self-interest resonate in a way with others that is ultimately productive as opposed to destructive? And certainly the more that I go about my self-interests by making the interests of others something that I care about, in fact, making their interests my own interests, the more I'm using empathy in a commercial setting that I think is ultimately kind of beneficial for the broader humanity, merely than simply beneficial for my bank book. That kind of exercise in empathy is something that I try to spend a lot of time talking about in my business ethics classes. I think that it is something that Adam Smith, in somewhat of an indirect way, thought about a great deal when he was writing his great work, The Wealth of Nations, kind of the foundational book of modern economics. And it's certainly something that I try to communicate to my students, who I think, generally speaking, are willing to take it to heart.
We're speaking to each other in a time of crisis, climate crisis, a pandemic. Just recently, we had COP26 happening, and now we're speaking about empathy. Do you think that we need more empathy towards the environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in many respects, the challenge of empathy is to think about the needs of other people. And, if we are guided primarily by our self-interest, which is, of course, what most traditional neoclassical economists will tell you, where do the interests of others tend to come in? And how are our actions going to affect others? I think we see specifically with concerns around climate change, this concern writ large. How do my own private actions end up affecting others, not just at home, but also around the world? And so the more that you are applying a kind of empathetic disposition and an empathetic orientation to the way that you engage your own activities, your interactions with others, the more you're going to think about the concerns of others and make them your own. And I would suggest that the more other regarding we tend to be, the more likely we are to kind of take into account the concerns of climate change that don't just affect us again here at home, wherever our homes may be, but people around the world today and on into the future. The more narrow your focus is, the less you may be concerned about such things. And therefore, the only way you're going to be concerned about climate change is if it affects you directly and immediately.
What you're speaking about, this focus of our actions, are we focusing on our very proximate environment, or are we focusing on the distant future and our whole world? That's something that fascinates me since quite a long time. Why is it so difficult for people to focus on this distant future or to think about the big picture?
Well, I think there are two reasons for that. First, as I was just saying, when you are kind of going about your days, we immediately know what our pressing needs are. I'm hungry. I'm tired. I have this meeting I have to make. I have to prepare for this big presentation. If I ask you, Alexander, what are your present pressing needs? You could give me a list without any problem whatsoever. But the more that we depart from our own immediate needs that are in the here and now, and we try to project into the future, our own future, to say nothing of the futures of other people, the more we're engaged in an exercise that is one part imagination and one part empathy. And on the one hand, that's not necessarily easy for us to do, right? Exercising the imagination, figuring out what the world will look like 50 years from now. I mean, certainly if you jumped into a time machine and you went back to 1971 and asked a bunch of people, what will life look like in 2021? Some of the answers you would get would look a lot like our lives today. Other answers, like, say, flying cars, would look nothing like our experience. So projecting into the future is actually quite hard for most of us to do, simply as a matter of exercising, again, the imagination and our capacity for empathy. What will the lives of people be like in 2071 as opposed to 2021? The other problem is simply one of kind of time and bandwidth. We all have our own pressing problems that are pulling us from day to day. How do we actually set aside time to think about these broader concerns that aren't necessarily so pressing? For very few of us is climate change an immediate pressing concern, as in something that I feel that I must resolve within the next hour, right? For most of us, even if we spend a lot of time thinking about it, it's something that we're constantly working toward, but it's not like a toothache. It's not something that we feel we have to resolve as fast as possible because it's causing us immense immediate pain. And the problem is, what that means is that those concerns that are not immense and immediate tend to get pushed down the list. We have to really make time for them. And I think today, as opposed to, say, 25 years ago, we're doing a far better job at making time to take into account those needs and concerns and to plan accordingly. But of course, as we all know, with regard to concerns like climate change, time is not necessarily on our side. So we have to find that sense of urgency about our own actions that we have with respect to, say, again, having a toothache. But though that sense of urgency doesn't otherwise come by us naturally when it comes to some of these bigger concerns that we think about as a global community.
That sense of urgency, from my perspective, is really needed. And we can see that now, Fridays for Future taking the climate crisis onto the streets, stepping up and trying to tell leaders what they believe they should do. Now, I'm wondering, can we manage a transformation with the current economic system that we have today? Or do we need a new system?
Well, that's a big question, and I think it's a very difficult question. What I would say is the more that we can think in broader terms of what our interests are, the more likely we are to save the present system. Look, capitalism is premised on a pretty simple psychological insight, which is we are more likely to be propelled in the work we do and committed to that work if we're motivated by our own immediate pressing interests, as opposed to kind of thinking through what necessarily the interests of others are. That's certainly the original premise of Adam Smith in his Wealth of Nations, that a concern for self-interest is more likely to push me than a concern for other people. Well, let's take that as a kind of stated fact for purposes of our conversation here. That doesn't resolve the question of what actually are our interests, right? I think our interests are far more varied than, say, a lot of economists and even some of my students give it credit for. I think all of us would say, for example, our friends and our family are part of our interests. I think we would also say concerns for the environment. But to the degree that we are thinking through the interests of others and making their interests our own interests, I think that we can act in a way consistent with, say, capitalism. The more that we think simply giving warrant to self-interest in a general way is going to kind of lead us in a dark, problematic direction, the less likely capitalism is going to be able to get us out of kind of the present crisis. What would kind of take its place? It's harder for me to say. But what I will say is, insofar as we're looking for ways to try to resolve the present concerns that we're dealing with, consistent with market forces and, again, the psychological insights of capitalism, we have to do this work of empathy. We have to make the concerns of others our own concerns. We have to cultivate a broader worldview. I think we're doing that. I see that, for example, in my students, and I think one of the open questions, and I don't have an answer to it, is are we doing it fast enough to address the problems we need to in an urgent fashion?
You have mentioned your students, and I guess that you have pretty tough conversations around this topic of solving current crisis. Do you have heated up discussions in the classroom?
You know, they're actually less heated than they once were. So I've taught some variation of my business ethics class, first at Harvard and now at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business since 2005. And if there's one, extraordinary difference that I've seen over the last 16 years, is that increasingly I have students who are bringing the types of problems you're describing, Alexander, to my attention, as opposed to me having to bring them to their attention. So I think even at a place like the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, a school filled with MBAs, people who are eager to go into the business world and to be successful themselves, the sense of social conscience that they bring into the classroom is tremendously striking to me and gives me, frankly, a lot of good reason for hope and optimism. If anything, I sometimes have to play the devil's advocate and kind of push back against some of their aspirations in order to kind of create a good, intelligent, thoughtful, rich discussion. But they come into the classroom with these concerns already urgent and pressing for them, and they're looking for ways to better articulate those concerns, as well as find ways to kind of pursue them in an actual business environment.
John Paul, you're mentioning leadership. What are indicators of good leadership from a scientific point of view?
Well, what I always tell my students is that when they think about leadership, especially those students who are a little more maybe data-driven, it's a good way of describing them, is that leadership is ultimately a human-focused art. I will tell my students, if they're not particularly excited about constantly interacting with human beings, and there are plenty of us like that who are a little maybe more introverted, leadership is not necessarily for them. You have to enjoy human beings, connecting with them, understanding them, in part because human beings have a tendency to be very frustrating. They make mistakes. They don't do things the way that you ask them to do them. You have to teach them. You have to inform them. It takes time for them to cultivate their skills. Sometimes they stumble. Sometimes they fail you. And if you don't have that kind of reservoir of patience in dealing with others, well, frankly, you're not ultimately going to be successful in your leadership efforts. So cultivating that kind of broad sense of patience that is necessary to interact with human beings and to kind of get the very best out of them is an essential quality for leadership. And frankly, I think one that we too often tend to overlook.
And we as a company, we have set different values for ourselves, for example. So these could be openness, reliability, appreciation, or excellence in the case of Greiner. What meaning does that have for an international company? Is that also related to leadership?
Oh, I think certainly the more that you are talking in terms of values, right, and finding ways to embody those values in the work that a company does, the example that the leaders within a company give, the more those values end up coming to life. The danger of talking in values is when they become mere abstractions, when they're merely something that you put up on the wall in the break room that people see, but never seem to be lived out in the activities of the company or in the lives of those who help to lead it. The more that you are actually giving life to those values, the more that they become marks of the kind of culture of a company, as opposed to simply things that we say but never do, the more that those values then inform the life of a company and can help to kind of support some of the kind of moral mission of an enterprise. But they have to be part of the culture. So they can be aspirational to a degree, right? Excellence is always an aspiration, but they have to be lived out in the day-to-day work of a business.
That reminds me of this famous quote by Peter Drucker, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast."
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, it's hard to talk in terms of culture because sometimes it's hard to kind of quantify elements of culture. But I think we've all been in work cultures that have been very healthy, and we've been in other work cultures that have been very sick. And we know that the difference is just dramatic. But culture tends to come from the very top, from the kinds of activities, the actions, the example that those who are in leadership tend to give. Now, that doesn't mean that sometimes you have wonderful leaders, but the people they collect around them fail them. But if your leadership is giving a bad example to begin with, the culture is hopeless. It doesn't matter what people do down below. Culture starts with the very top, and ideally it tends to trickle down.
That was my next question. How to bring life to these values? You've already given one example, one best practice example. Do you maybe have another one?
I think the more that you can talk openly and honestly about those values and ask hard questions about them, how do they shape our work? How do they maybe actually limit some of the decisions we make? What I often tell my students in my business ethics classes is that if you live in a world without trade-offs, you live in a world without ethics. If you never have to make any kinds of sacrifices, then you live in the best of all worlds. But actually, no one lives in precisely that world. The one way of measuring your personal ethics or the ethics of your company is trying to understand what trade-offs you're willing to make and those that you will not make. And if you're always trading everything in favor of expediency or convenience, you're not actually making any hard moral decisions. So speaking about those values, trying to figure out the trade-offs that are connected to them and living out those values are the way in which you bring them to life and the way in which you make them the DNA of your culture within a company.
John Paul, actually, I had quite a hard time preparing this interview, and simply because your CV and your career is pretty outstanding. And one of your jobs sounded particularly exciting to me. You were a policy analyst for Barack Obama's presidential campaign in 2008. What was your assignment? Did sustainability or economic models play a role there?
Well, when I was lucky enough to spend time on the Barack Obama campaign in 2008 as part of the policy team, I was actually in graduate school at the time. So I interned with the policy team from the fall of 2007 through 2008. I was also teaching. So probably over that time, I spent about 2,000 hours with that particular team. I did a lot of what you typically do on a presidential campaign, which is a little bit of everything. I helped to assemble the kinds of booklets that would go in to prepare then candidate Obama for the debates. I would do kind of data and policy research if we were proposing some new kind of novel policy for a particular area. I would work occasionally with the speechwriting team, kind of providing them data, facts, or information. And I'd participate in the conversations we would have around the kind of broader policy vision of the team. It was a very exciting endeavor to be part of. The one thing I would say is that when you're on a presidential campaign, for better or for worse, you can't actually make policy because you're not in power. And so a lot of what you're doing is describing a kind of vision for policy that you hope that if your candidate is successful, he's able ultimately to implement. So it's very forward-looking, and that's very different than the work that, say, friends of mine are now doing on Capitol Hill here in the United States or at the Biden White House, where they're thinking through kind of concrete policy trade-offs that could actually come into law as soon as next week. What we were doing on the campaign was looking ahead, not just months, but perhaps even more than a year out, to the kind of presidency Barack Obama might ultimately have and the types of policy issues that he ultimately might support. So to a certain extent, that work had maybe a little bit more of an academic feel than it does when you're on Capitol Hill, but it was a wonderful experience. And as hard as I worked, because it was tremendously hard work, it's something I'll forever be grateful for, to have had a chance to be part of it.
That sounds very, very exciting. Coming back from a presidential campaign in the United States to Greiner, going a little smaller, but still there's 12,000 colleagues around the world making big and small decisions every day. Do you have any kind of advice for our managers at Greiner to advance sustainability and to contribute to a better tomorrow?
Absolutely. I mean, again, I will emphasize two things that I've already mentioned. First is the sense that leadership is that human-focused art. And so the more that you can bring into your day a sense of patience in the people that you work with, the better performance you're ultimately going to get out of them and the better example you're going to set for others. Patience is always at a premium because your time is at a premium. But I think the more you're able to allocate toward that sense of patience and therefore time, over the long run, the better your performance and the performance of those around you will ultimately be. The second thing I would suggest, and this is again apropos of time, because we all seem so time constrained these days. And so we have to think about how we kind of manage our time and also how we make time out of our days, is that insofar as you're trying to address issues, climate change being a good example, that aren't like toothaches, aren't going to be pressing and immediate, not something that you need to solve this afternoon, but something that you'll be thinking about for the next 5, 10, 20 years, maybe the duration of your career, the more that you can't push off thinking about those matters. Again, if you have a toothache, you are trying to find a dentist as fast as you can to resolve it, because you can't do anything else until that toothache is resolved. If you're thinking about issues that are going to take years to resolve and you are going to be one small part of a broader effort, you can always push off thinking about those issues and acting on them. And so you have to really work to make those issues a priority, to push them up that kind of priority list. Because if you don't, they're always going to fall down to the bottom. And that ultimately means they're not going to be addressed.
John Paul, I probably have 20 more questions on my list here, but I'm afraid that we're running slowly out of time for this podcast episode. So as a very final thing, I would like to invite you to do a short word wrap with me, if that's fine for you.
Sure.
Fantastic. So I would give you one word or one term, and you can reply with whatever comes to your mind. There can be just one word, it can be a sentence or a thought. And if you're ready, then I will start with the first one.
You do it.
First term, Chicago.
Michael Jordan.
Adam Smith.
The theory of moral sentiments.
Barack Obama.
A wonderful man.
Leadership.
My job.
Wolf of Wall Street.
A wonderful, morally ambiguous film.
Good leadership.
A lifelong commitment.
Bad leadership.
Something you stumble into and is hard to get out of.
And last but not least, your message to the world.
Patience is a virtue that is too often overlooked, and it's one that you need to commit yourself to and cultivate it every day.
Thank you very much for that message, John Paul, and thank you very much for joining this podcast today.
Alexander, it's been such a pleasure joining you for this conversation. Thank you so much for inviting me.
And thank you everybody for listening. I really have to advise you, go to YouTube and search for the in-house ethicist, John Paul Rollert. You will find amazing videos of John Paul explaining very complex concepts like capitalism or greed, and you will learn a lot for sure. Thank you everybody for listening. Have a great day and stay healthy.
Greiner Talks, a Greiner podcast. Subscribe now.